Yeah, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. So furthermore, disclaimers, I'm also not a philosopher, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, I'm also not a mathematician, but all these things do come together in my talk, so I'm very open also to feedback and critique. So in my talk today, I want to talk about the nature of consciousness. So consciousness is typically defined as a person's awareness of something, or as the state of being aware of one's surroundings. But over the past decade or so, I think within the scientific study of consciousness, there's this growing realization that there are these more minimal forms of consciousness that do not have this consciously experienced first-person perspective. And in fact, some of these minimal forms of consciousness have been reported for millennia by advanced meditators. The main sort of minimal form of consciousness that has received the most scientific attention is the so-called state of pure or non-dual awareness. And this is a state of awareness that is characterized by a lack of a sense of self, but also a lack of a sense of time and a lack of a sense of space. But nonetheless, when one is in this state, one is clearly awake and aware. And within some contemplative Buddhist traditions, it is claimed that this pure awareness actually forms the ground to all experiencing. So it is the background against which all our experiences arise. It always resides in the background, but we're typically not aware of this awareness because it's clouded by the ordinary structures of cognition. But also in other fields, like the field of psychedelic research, there are reports of non-egoic forms of consciousness. They're often called ego dissolution. And so this is a quote from somebody describing their DMT experience. There was a feeling of being in the nucleus of the psyche, awareness of all and everything. In my experience, there was no self, no body, no time or space, but there was being. And there was also consciousness. I could remember everything afterwards. Even though I wasn't there, there was observation and recording going on. And then in the field of sleep research, also in contrast to long-held notions that during deep non-REM sleep we're actually completely unconscious or unaware, there's also reports of these non-egoic forms of awareness during deep sleep. And Jennifer Wind called these experiences the minimal phenomenological experience. And so it seems to be the case that there is a family of MPE-like states that Metzinger in his book, The Elephant and the Blind, said all share similar characteristics, phenomenal characteristic in the sense that there is no egoic self-consciousness, there's no time representation, and there's no spatial frame of reference. It seems to be that these states represent consciousness in its most basic form, so consciousness as such. And this has theoretical implications, of course, because any theory of consciousness should be able to account also for such minimal non-egoic forms of awareness. And that actually brings me to the MPE project. So this conference brings together researchers from the MOC field and the MPE field. The MPE field sort of, I could say, started with the MPE project that was actually initiated by Thomas Metzinger several years ago. And this project aims to determine what characterizes minimum phenomenological experiences like states. How are these states initiated at the neurobiological level? How can we understand them computationally? And how can we describe them at the phenomenological level? And so it brings together a network of scholars and scientists that all sort of address these outstanding questions. And later today, there'll be a whole sequence of MPE talks, and also we continue with that tomorrow. So hopefully my talk will set also a little bit the stage for this series of presentations. In my talk, I'm also going to talk about pure awareness and MPE-like state, but only to set the stage to then, in the second part of my talk about reports also by advanced meditators that they can induce states in which actually awareness completely disappears. And so these are states characterized by a complete absence of awareness. And some meditators even report that they can voluntarily induce these states and maintain them for extended periods of time, even up to 6 days. And what is very interesting is that this state of cessation seems to be preceded by MPE-like experiences and also to be followed when one comes out of the state by an NPE-like experience. So it seems to be the case that pure awareness sort of lies at the border of cessation of awareness, raising the possibility that there may be a functional relationship also between these two states. And in fact, one may wonder, and this is something also that Thomas Metzinger raised as a possibility in his book, The Elephant and the Blight, whether this state of cessation really is characterized by an absence of awareness, or whether it concerns an even more minimal form of consciousness that is simply not available for personal level memory recall afterwards. In other words, is cessation an absence of awareness, or is it an island of awareness where the experience is just not only disconnected from sensory input and motor output, but also from episodic memory? And so I think a better understanding of these minimal forms of consciousness is important because they can be revealing about, I would argue, the nature of the human mind, the nature of human experience. They raise all sorts of interesting questions. Is pure awareness indeed the ground of all experiencing? Is the availability of personal level memory recall a necessary element of consciousness? Is it really possible to voluntarily turn consciousness off and then back on, and even, after 6 days, for 6 days? And how is first-person consciousness experience and reconstructed? How do we go from ordinary consciousness experience to pure awareness to cessation of awareness, and then back again from absence of awareness to pure awareness to our ordinary mind? And more generally, to what extent can we voluntarily control how we experience ourselves in the world, and what are the long-term consequences of this? Both pure awareness and cessation of awareness have only relatively recently come under scientific scrutiny, but nonetheless, both of these states have been reported for millennia. And so I think an important question, which sort of forms the overarching question of my talk today, is how can we incorporate pure awareness and cessation within our current scientific understanding of the human mind and consciousness, if we can at all? And I contend that it may be possible when we capitalize on a general account of brain functioning, namely predictive processing. And what I want to do in my talk today, therefore, is first present predictive processing as a conceptual framework for understanding how pure awareness may arise in our experience. And I know that probably many of you already know what predictive processing is, and the NPE crowd probably also already knows about our predictive processing framework of meditation. But nonetheless, I'm going to talk you through this. It will take some time, but I think it's important because it sets the stage also for the second part of my talk, where I talk about cessation of awareness and where I try to extend this framework to cessation. And in the second part of my talk, I'll also present some first empirical findings on cessation that we collected in the lab from a very advanced meditator who allegedly can induce voluntarily this state for up to 6 days, as well as some findings from collaborators of us at Harvard University. And then I'll end by discussing some important future avenues for research. So predictive processing claims to be this unifying theory of the brain to explain what it is that our brains do. And basically it claims that everything that's happening in the brain is geared towards the minimization of prediction errors. And so it departs from the fact that our brains do not have direct access to the world around us. Our brains do not directly see, they do not directly hear, because the only thing that they have access to are the electrical signals that are conveyed by the senses, sensory impressions. But the causes of those inputs are hidden to the brain. So how then can brains perceive? And so from this situation necessarily follows that our brains must build models, generative models, of the likely causes of their sensory inputs based on their experiences and statistical structure in the world, and then continuously test these predictions against the incoming input and minimize prediction errors to ensure reliable models. And you can see how this turns the traditional notion of perception on its head, because rather than perception being a largely stimulus-driven, bottom-up process of feature detection and evidence accumulation, in this view, perception is a process of top-down inference, in which our brains continuously try to predict what is out there, And then what is fed up the processing hierarchy is not necessarily the sensory input, not the sensory input per se, but rather the mismatch between the brain's a priori predictions or the sensory input, so-called prediction errors. Because only prediction errors are informative still to the brain. Only prediction errors still contain unexplained variance in the sensorium that the brain did not yet, was not yet able to account for. But of course, our brains are not models of the world just to perceive. They're models of the world because they're part of a larger organism that needs to sustain itself as a living being in the world, and therefore also must interact with the world and know, what the affordances are in the world so that it can generate the sensory inputs that it needs. Focus. Thanks. It's important to point out that just like our brains cannot directly access the world, they also cannot directly access the body. Here too, they only have indirect access to the body via interoceptive signals. And so here too, they have to instantiate models about how interoceptive signals are likely generated. And importantly, within the predictive processing framework, the body is the first prior. Because at the most fundamental level, our brains expect the body to be in certain states that are conducive to its continued survival. We expect to be within a certain temperature range. We expect to be well fed. And whenever these physiological signals are out of bounds or out of range, there's a huge prediction error that brains must resolve. In this case, the expectations are very stubborn. You can't just think, oh, there's a signal of hunger, and I update my belief I'm not hungry. Because if you do that for long enough, then you're just simply going to die. And so these prediction errors have to be minimized through action, for example, by eating. And so action is really important in this framework because through actions, we can generate the sensory input that we expect. And so we can confirm our expectations that we are well fed. And importantly, action also comes about through sensory prediction error minimization. We come into action when we predict certain sensory inputs that are not then there. There's a prediction error, and then we need to act to resolve or to minimize that prediction error. The other thing that's important about active inference is that it's really through action that our brains can learn about the affordances of the world. They can learn about how, as an agent, they can manipulate the environment to generate the information that the system needs. And so perception in that sense is not tuned to truth, it's tuned to fitness. And so we perceive the world as it is relevant to us. And so our brains instantiate these models of how interoceptive and exteroceptive signals are generated, and it does so in a hierarchical manner. So it does so across different timescales and levels of abstraction, so that we can also anticipate, for example, future homeostatic needs. And when you think about it, we often eat before we're even hungry. But at the most fundamental level, you can say perception and action are structured towards generating self-relevant sensory inputs that the organism prefers, that confirm its shape, its form, that it exists. And that's also sometimes called self-evidencing. And so there are a few important points to make here. So first is that, in this framework, the insight really comes first because our brains continuously shape their own reality from the inside out. And of course, the outside is also important because the task is to align oneself as best as possible, to our eco-niche, to the outside world. But the inside comes first. And to demonstrate this, I always like to use the example of tickling, because why cannot you tickle yourself? Well, that's obviously because when you tickle yourself, you already anticipate how your own actions are going to generate these sensations. And so the prediction error is smaller, and therefore there's less surprise and less of the experiencing of tickling. And the other thing that I think is beautiful about this framework is that also our sense of self is automatically roped into the predictive processing machinery. Because if you have to predict how your own actions are going to change the sensory input, you also have to model yourself as a hidden cause in the environment. So our sense of self is automatically roped into the predictive processing machinery, and also intimately tied to the minimization of expected surprise, what's going to happen in the future. because a living system cannot infer the consequences of its action unless it embodies a model of the future. Another important concept in this framework is the concept of precision or precision weighting. Because obviously it would not be good if we would be simply at the whim of the environment, so that whenever there's a prediction error, brains revise their beliefs, because the world is noisy and also sensory inputs may not be representative for the world at large. And so what our brains must also do is deal with statistical volatility and estimate how reliable in a particular context sensory inputs are. So they have to determine their precision. And this is a second order prediction. It's the estimation of how reliable, how informative new sensory evidence is. And I really like always this example of, going to the toilet at night and you see your couch and it looks orange, but, in regular daylight, it's red. And you're not then suddenly going to update your belief to, oh, my couch is orange, because we know that in the dark, visual information is low definition, it's not reliable. So by assigning less precision then to that observation, we can maintain a stable perceptual model. And so precision weighting ensures that only those prediction errors with high expected precision that we consider meaningful, informative, can revise our beliefs. And that gives the brain a mechanism to control the relative influence of new experiences over, old experiences or existing beliefs in this context-sensitive manner. And so high precision prediction errors are upregulated, so they can penetrate deeper into the brain, and low precision prediction errors are downregulated, so they exert no or less of an influence onto our belief system. And so it has been proposed that attention, in fact, maps onto precision weighting, because we know from a large literature in humans and animals that what attention can do is actually modulate sensory responses, so it can modulate sensory gain. So when we attend to a stimulus, the sensory response it evokes is actually larger compared to when we don't attend to it. And so attention may map onto this mechanism of precision weighting. And so I already said at the beginning of this that prediction error minimization is really can explain everything that the brain does. So it's not just perception and action, but basically all mental activity is sort of enslaved or aims to minimize prediction errors. And that also means that we can understand high-level cognitive processes as ultimately geared towards minimizing prediction errors. Our brains model the world hierarchically at different time scales, also at those levels of the predictive processing hierarchy that are detached from the current environment. And when you think about it, we spend a great deal of our time just, planning things in the future, thinking about things that may have happened in the past. We imagine ourselves at beautiful beaches, et cetera, et cetera. So we continuously, you could say, engage in these temporally deep cognitive processes that are also aimed ultimately at minimizing prediction errors, but covertly in service of future action. And so in a sense, you could say there are mental actions, this is also a term that was introduced by Thomas, that engage in counterfactual as-if hypothesis testing, that then ultimately benefit how we interact with the world in the long run. And so the other thing that's important to point out here is that also here we model ourselves sort of in this narrative of our thoughts. We're about, if I go to the store, then I'll do this and then I'll do that. So also the narrative self is roped into this predictive modeling. And the self then is also hierarchically modeled within this framework. There's the basic sense of self and the narrative self that sort of just logically get roped into this machinery. And so very importantly is that because all mental activity ultimately is constructed through these predictive models that have previously come to reliably reduce prediction errors, learning is a much more pervasive feature of experience than is traditionally assumed in cognitive neuroscience. So also higher level thought, typically thought to be very abstract, in this framework is ultimately tied to our past experiences. And I really like the term canalization that Card, Harris and Friston proposed in the context of psychedelics in a recent paper. And this is a nice illustration of this process of canalization. So each of these pink dots reflects like a thought or a feeling. And you can see that these initial pink dots create like a dent in our mental landscape, making it more likely that subsequent thoughts and feelings start following the same mental trajectory in our mental landscape. And so, how we thought in the past can create these valleys in our mental landscape that then automatically bias how we think and feel in the future. And that's obviously adaptive because that aligns us with our eco-niche. But of course, it can also be maladaptive. For example, if the environment changes, if we're no longer in a traumatic situation, for example, or when these mental behaviors are too deeply carved. And so there must be some flexibility. And that raises really important questions about the plasticity of the predictive mind, because there's this delicate balance between, on the one hand, being open to the environment, and on the other hand, maintaining stability, being closed off from the environment. And we've previously proposed that this is a tension that's internalized at the level of the brain. But this question of the plasticity of the predictive mind then brings me to meditation, because there's some striking parallels between how in predictive processing the mind is conceptualized and how within Buddhism the mind is conceptualized. And so a major premise within Buddhism is that our everyday experience is conditioned by our past experiences. There's the notion of conditioned existence. And in fact, what is being proposed is that all our experiences are automatically structured in an approach avoidance ignorance manner, in that we respond to things that we seek to obtain, and differently from to things that we wish to avoid, and we also ignore things that we deem irrelevant to us. And so every percept and action is ultimately utility-based, keeping ourselves in mind. And within Buddhism, therefore, our experiences are automatically linked to what they call the three unwholesome roots: attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And these are also called the three poisons, because what they do is they cloud the mind and they give rise to suffering or dissatisfaction because of craving that they cause. But then Buddhism also says there's a way out of this through meditation. And so in a recent paper that I wrote together with Ruben Laukonen, back then he was still a postdoc in my group, and now he's an assistant professor in Australia, we sort of build on these interesting parallels between how the mind is conceptualized within predictive processing and how it is conceptualized within Buddhism, and propose that we can actually reconceptualize or better understand the effects of these meditation practices, not just on regular cognition, but also how they can maybe lead to these esoteric states like pure awareness. And so we reconceptualize three main styles of meditation within sort of from this predictive processing framework. And the first, and these three styles of meditation, I've listed them here. These are just umbrella terms, and they do not do justice to the wide variety of Buddhist practices, meditation practices that's out there, the many more meditation practices. But these are three styles of meditation that you can find across different Buddhist traditions. And on the first two, definitely also some more secular Western-based meditation practices are also founded. And so the core idea that we propose in this paper is that these three styles of meditation can be placed on a continuum, and that they gradually bring the practitioner more and more and more into the present moment by gradually or progressively abating hierarchical, temporally deep predictive processing. And when you think about it, when you think about the state of non-dual or pure awareness, if you really rest awareness in just this moment in time, the current moment in time is no longer situated with respect to the previous moment in time or the next moment in time. And so then an experience of timelessness is a logical consequence. And the same goes for a sense of self. If you do not anticipate the future anymore, there's also no basic self-modeling going on. You do not anticipate anymore how you may change your own future. And so then also your sense of self should logically fall out of your experience. And in fact, if you're truly in the present moment, all conceptualization and intentionality should fall away, giving rise to this experience of pure awareness. And so how does it work? So focused attention meditation, probably all of you are familiar with this. This is a concentrative style of meditation where you just focus your attention on one object. And typically those are breath sensations. And then whenever you notice your mind wandering, you just bring your attention back to the object of your attention. And so in predictive processing terms, you could say what you do is you assign very high precision to one continuous source of present moment sensory input, the breath. And the consequence of that is that you assign relatively little precision to anything else that could normally otherwise habitually arise in mind, all these automatic thought patterns and feeling patterns. You do not consider those informative because you assign high precision to that object of attention. And so with more advanced practice, you're no longer engaged in this sort of narrative mode of experiencing that I think normally dominates, the resting state. But instead, there is this less abstracted present mode of experiencing. And then typically, once one has sort of calmed the mind of all this clutter, one can move to the second style of meditation called open monitoring. That also includes like mindfulness, vipassana meditation, where one drops the object of attention and just simply opens up awareness to whatever may arise in experience, be it a thought or a feeling or a cessation, but without reacting to it, without judging it, without responding. And so this cultivates a non-selective form of attention. There's no selection going on. It's a very bare form of attention. And attentional selection in predictive processing terms is, that's about precision weighting. So what you basically do is you assign equal precision to anything that may occur in mind and consequently very low precision. And so that reduces the ability of whatever arises in mind to penetrate deeper temporally into the predictive processing hierarchy. And so that induces non-judgmental observing. And as that increases, also the system may start to experience a kind of pure sensing without evaluation. You start to see, for example, this is what meditators report, when you sit still for an extended period of time, you may start to experience pain in your body. But then you realize that there's first signals from the body and then there's the experience of pain. And then with that realization, the experience of pain may drop out. And so through open monitoring meditation, one may induce a mode of experiencing that is earlier at a temporally more sort of shallow level in the processing hierarchy. And then the third style of non-dual of meditation, non-dual or a pure awareness meditation, is a style of meditation that is typically considered much more advanced. It's also much less often practiced. And here one aims to discover sort of this pure awareness that I described at the beginning of my talk, that is considered the ground of all experiencing. And so within focused attention meditation and open monitoring meditation, there is still observation going on. There is still a subject observing how thoughts arise, for example, in open monitoring. But from the perspective of the non-dual discovery, this duality between subject and object is also a construct that we've built based on our past experiences. And I really like this example that I think I first read about it in a paper by John Donne, of a cup. So even a seemingly direct experience like that of a cup is intimately tied to our past experiences with a cup. We only know this is a cup because we interacted with it in the past. And it's automatically also tied to potential futures, potential changes in sensory input, because we know we can drink from the cup. And because there is this anticipated future, there's also automatically a sense of self that arises, this basic sense of self that arises with seeing a cup. And so as a final release of any abstraction away from the here and now, even such temporarily shallow models related to conceptualization, sensing should be let go. For example, and there are different ways to sort of induce this state, but one way is just simply realizing that subject and object always co-arise in experience. And so that then should logically lead to the state of pure awareness, where there's no sense of time, no sense of self. And also all conceptualization and intentionality should fall away. Because if one's truly in the present moment, there's no anticipation of, you inducing changes in sensory input, your sense of self should fall away. If you're just in this moment is not situated within the temporal context, so your sense of time should also fall away. And so just to summarize this, we propose that meditation gradually reduces temporally deep, counterfactual, hierarchical predictive processing through physical and mental inaction. And I didn't really touch upon the physical, we can talk about that later. And this can not only explain changes in regular cognition, but also changes in the sense of self, and ultimately also how this non-egoic form of consciousness may arise within the system. And we feel that our account may also explain sort of the positive benefits of meditation that are reported outside of the meditative context, because if you sort of flatten the mental landscape, if these valleys that were deeply carved are, rendered less deep because you prevent yourself from continuously revisiting these habitual trajectories in your mental landscape, then that should, of course, render your ability to think in other ways and feel in other ways outside of the mental, outside of the meditative context, more, how do you say that? I lost my sentence. It should render your ability to, anyway, it should enhance cognitive flexibility. And our account may also explain negative effects of meditation because, during these, in particular, the more advanced meditative practices, there are these radical changes in our sense of self. And so if you get stuck in those, then, that can have debilitating consequences outside of the meditative context. Okay, with the eye on time, I'm just going to skip over this. So I think our account can very nicely explain how sort of ordinary structures of mind, like our sense of time and our sense of self, may fall out. But of course, the pure awareness state must also be inferred. It cannot exist outside of the predictive processing machinery. And so what is left in the state? And so Thomas Metzinger, he collected experiential reports of over 500 people who have, allegedly had these sort of MPE-like experiences, these pure awareness experiences. And he found that the two most prominent semantic markers of the state of pure awareness are actually wakefulness and epistemic openness, knowing. And what he proposed is that maybe pure awareness is the content of a predictive model, a Bayesian representation of tonic alertness. And I think that's actually brilliant, Thomas, because tonic alertness is mediated by these brainstem nuclei that shape the conditions for wakefulness. So they determine the extent to which our cortex is aroused and can process and respond to events in the environment. And so it's intimately tied to wakefulness. And so it can explain wakefulness. And the other thing is, tonic alertness itself is not the responding or the processing of things, but it sort of reflects this preparedness or this capacity for attentional agency. And that may also explain epistemic openness as like a capacity for knowing. And the way Thomas talks about it is that there is still this capacity to act or this connection to an abstract space of epistemic possibilities. And so even though maybe the experience is temporarily shallow, it's still sort of linked to potential counterfactual futures. And so there's still maybe an element of self-knowledge there. All right, so that was predictive processing and pure awareness, which hopefully set the stage for the second part of my talk, cessation. So what is cessation? I already briefly talked about it, but in a recent paper, we defined it as, on the basis of Buddhist descriptions and also reports from advanced meditators, we defined it as the absence of all experiencing and consciousness with no retrospective awareness of anything having taken place during the absence, accompanied by a subsequent profound sense of clarity, openness, and vitality. And so this fading away or cessation of experience is emphasized in Buddhist meditation and is said to be of great significance. There's also debates about this in the Buddhist literature, but but generally is considered to be of great significance. And in the Sutta Nipata, the following is said: whatever dissatisfaction or suffering arises is all in consequence of consciousness. And by the destruction of consciousness, there is no origin of dissatisfaction. And so the idea is that this state of cessation, also called Nirodha Samapatti, that there is no conditioned experience, that is the end of all craving. And that is, of course, of high relevance within this Buddhist context. But there's also insights to be obtained afterwards. So we collected data from this one very advanced meditator who can voluntarily induce these states of cessation. And he said that for him, the value also very much lies in sort of the few moments when one comes out of the state. Because in those few moments, it's very brief, he said only a few seconds, maybe at most a few seconds, you can see how reality again arises in consciousness. So how the mind is reconstructed. And for those of you who are interested more in the phenomenological nature of this state, Emma Demsar later this morning will actually give a talk in which she also present results from microphenomenological interviews that she conducted with our advanced meditator. So it's important to point out that there are two different kinds of cessations. There are Nirodha cessations, which you could say are spontaneous in the sense that they can occur during very specific deep meditative practices, but the meditator cannot control when precisely they occur or how long they will last. And so these represent very short gaps or cuts in the stream of consciousness that are also often followed by a sense of clarity and openness. And then there's also Nirodha Samapatti, which is a state of cessation of awareness that can be voluntarily induced for a pre-specified amount of time. Sometimes up to as long as 6 days. And allegedly, this is only available to the most advanced meditators, and it also is supposed to have the strongest after effects. And so here one sets an intention to come out of the state after a specific time, and is warned against not doing that longer than 6 or 7 days, because otherwise it can be dangerous to the body. And interestingly, it is reported that you cannot be woken up from the state. And there's also reports of people who are in this state for a little bit longer that their breathing is barely perceptible, that the body feels cold and also stiff. And so it seems to be a very low metabolic state. And also that the body feels cold and stiff, it sort of raises these associations to state of hibernation. I mean, we speculate about this in the paper. I don't know if this is at all a possibility, but it's sort of interesting that bears also go to caves to hibernate, and then monks also go to caves to meditate. But in any case, it also supposedly has these strong physiological effects. And so to enter the state of Nirodha Samapatti, one has to go through the stages of the jhanas meditation. And I don't really have time to go into this. I highly recommend this paper by, I don't know if you can read that, but Sparby and Matthew Saget, where they talk about the jhanas in a much more detailed manner and try to look at different accounts and try to find common denominators. But just simply looking at how these different jhana stages are being called, you can already see that they have these MPE-like qualities. Stage 5 is called infinite boundless space. And stage 6 is called infinite boundless consciousness. And stage 7 is called nothingness. And there apparently one takes as the object the sort of the gap in between experiences where there's no thing. And so the nothingness that lies between subjectivity and objectivity. And then in stage 8, which is called neither perception nor non-perception, there is no perception of anything, not even of the no thing. And one may enter this state allegedly by turning attention to awareness of the nothingness. And then to go to cessation, apparently there's this another state, a transitional state that is called the signless state, where this difference between subject and object then completely falls away. And then you have a state that is more akin to a non-dual pure awareness. And that then sets the stage for cessation to occur. And so that's really interesting, because that seems to suggest indeed that, one goes from pure awareness to cessation of awareness, and that there may be this functional link between the two states. And so that cessation may actually, maybe we could place it on our continuum, and maybe it represents an even more temporally shallow state. So while non-dual awareness is still characterized by this wakeful present moment awareness that's characterized by knowing, cessation is characterized by the absence of awareness and wakefulness, and also the absence of knowing. And so maybe what happens during cessation is that there's sort of this final release of this belief that one is awake. And to go back to this notion of epistemic openness that I just talked about, in pure awareness, there is still this quality of knowing. There's still this abstract space of epistemic possibilities, sort of, this feeling of a potential epistemic future. And Metzinger also talks about pure awareness as a non-egoic, non-conceptual form of self-knowledge. There is still this capacity that one can know. And so maybe what happens, this is speculative during cessation, is that temporal depth is further reduced such that now also this capacity for knowing in the future falls out, and therewith any self-knowledge, and that actually then causes also the experience of the absence of awareness, because really all self has fallen out. So what about the scientific study of cessation? So there's very little empirical work on cessation and how you can characterize it at the scientific level. So there are some studies that have been published. In 2017, there was a paper by Aviva Berkovic-Ohana where she looked at these brief gaps in conscious experience. There's the paper where we introduce cessation in meditation sort of to the scientific literature, and also try to conceptualize it from a predictive processing perspective. And we outline some important avenues also for future research. And then there's some studies by Matthew Sesset's group at Harvard University. So it turned out that when we were doing our study with this one advanced meditator, that at Harvard University, they'd also been measuring what happens at the neural level during these brief periods of cessation. So they had access to an expert meditator who could induce these deep meditative states in which then these brief periods of cessation would regularly occur. And that also makes studying those scientifically tractable. And so they actually found some stuff in their data that we try to replicate also in our data, because of course an important question is also, are these brief periods of cessation, are they similar in nature to these more extended, longer periods of cessation that can be voluntarily induced? And so in our study, we had this advanced meditator come to the lab twice. And in the first session, we had the meditator, we recorded their brain activity using EEG, and we also recorded all sorts of physiological variables from the autonomic nervous system during 3 different kinds of states: just a resting state, a focused attention meditation state, and a Rhoda Samapati. And each of these states lasts about 35 minutes, and he cycled through them twice. So we could also look at repetition of effects. And in each of these 6 blocks, there were 3 phases. There was first a phase of just the state, so no external stimulation. And during the other 2 phases, we presented the practitioner with auditory stimuli that they did not have to respond to. So there was not a task. If one can even do a task in a state of cessation. But the first kind of stimuli we presented were semantic in nature. So they were words, and they could be neutral or valenced, so that we could see to what extent in a state of cessation there would still be semantic processing and processing of valence information. I'm not going to talk about that today. And then in the third sort of part, we presented sequences of auditory stimuli to the brain of the practitioner. And it's well known that when you present a sequence of, in our case, vowels, so A, and there are regularities to them, our brains quickly pick up on this and start to predict that the next stimulus will also be an A. But then when you present suddenly a different vowel, an O, there's a prediction error. And this prediction error you can actually measure with EEG at the front of the scalp as a negative potential. And so there's a greater negative potential in response to unpredicted auditory stimuli, deviant stimuli, compared to standard predicted stimuli. And this is called the mismatch negativity. And interestingly, work by Antoine Lutz and colleagues has shown that this mismatch negativity is still there, is preserved during pure awareness. But then there's work by Stanislas Dehaene that has shown that this mismatch negativity is completely eliminated during deep sleep. And so our question was, what do we see during the state of cessation? Is it eliminated like in this other state of unconsciousness, or is it still preserved? And so here you can see the mismatch negativity data. Here you see this negative potential for the three conditions, and you can see that numerically it's smallest in the Nirodha Samapati state and largest in the focused attention meditation state, and the resting state is somewhere in between. But this difference did not bear out statistically. And there's clearly still mismatch negativity also during the cessation state. We also looked at the pattern of activity, because you can also look at the identity of the stimulus that's presented. And so you can look at what specific vowel is represented in the activity patterns of the brain. Is it an O or an A? And we found that in all three conditions, we could also decode the identity of the unpredicted vowel, including in cessation. But again, this representation of the unexpected vowel was weaker, but not statistically weaker when we conducted statistical tests. And so low-level basic habits of pattern recognition and prediction error minimization appear to remain largely intact in cessation. Then there was also a second session where the meditator actually came to the sleep lab that's headed by Dr. Lucia Talamini at the University of Amsterdam. And there we gave the practitioner 120 minutes to sleep first. And the hope was that we would have 90 minutes of a full sleep-wake cycle so that we could compare the state of cessation that we also measured in the sleep lab to both stages of light sleep and deep sleep, and to see to what extent it may share characteristics at the neurophysiological level. And there was also resting state. And again, we measured high-density EEG and all sorts of autonomic measures. Unfortunately, our participant reported that, and maybe this is predictable, they were hooked up to EEG, they had all sorts of sensors, and then they were put in a sleep lab and told to sleep. They had only slept lightly. There had been some dreaming. And this is also what our EEG data showed. There were no signatures of really deep sleep. So we can only contrast cessation to lighter phases of sleep. We asked the meditator to come out of the state after 90 minutes spontaneously. And during the first 90 minutes, we observed very little body and eye movements. It was very stable on the outside. And then really at the 90-minute mark, we saw that at a physiological level, there were changes. So heart rate, for example, went up. And then after 104 minutes, actually, the participants spontaneously opened their eyes. So that's sort of interesting. So then we also looked at our neural measures, and the first thing we looked at, does cessation lead to a reduction in brain activity? And this was sort of inspired by our collaboration with the group at Harvard, because they reported in their meditator that when they averaged across all these different periods of brief cessation, that if they looked in the 40 seconds before and the 40 seconds after, that there were these reductions in alpha band activity. That sort of became more pronounced leading up to the cessation, and then right after cessation, they were most pronounced. And that's interesting because alpha band activity is associated with cortical excitability. And the other thing they reported was that right after the cessation, there was this reduction in midfrontal theta activity. And midfrontal theta activity is related to the monitoring of experience, of performance. And so that signal was also reduced. And so we wondered, what do we see in our meditator during Nirodha Samapati? Do we replicate this? So here you see the power frequency spectrum of NS compared to rest. And we found significant changes in theta band activity, alpha band activity, like they did in the Harvard study, but also in the beta band activity, in the beta band, I mean. And compared to light sleep, we see something similar, but after correction for multiple comparisons, this difference was only significant in the theta band. And so we see these changes in brain activity during Nirodha Samapati compared to waking, and in the theta band specifically compared to light sleep. The other thing we looked at was cortical-cortical communication, again, in collaboration with our colleagues at Harvard. They found that during these short periods of cessation, that there was reduced synchronization between oscillatory, like neural activity signals, as recorded from different places on the scalp. And so I don't have time to go into the details, but you can use the face-like index to sort of quantify how much communication there is between different parts of the brain. And they found that in the alpha band leading up to the cessation event, there was this reduction in cortical-cortical communication that then went up over the course of the subsequent 40 seconds. And we replicated that in our study as well. So we found that PLI in the alpha band was significantly lower during NS compared to sleep. And in sleep, it was significantly lower compared to rest. And so we also found these changes in cortical-cortical communication. And so we broadly replicate findings from 2 different meditators from 2 different labs, comparing Nirodha with Nirodha Samapati. So what about this physiological stuff? So here the data analysis is still ongoing, but we did not really observe very remarkable changes in terms of autonomic nervous system activity during NS. So in session 1, when we look at heart rate and respiration rate, very similar in NS compared to rest. But heart rate and respiration rate were lower during FA meditation. And the same for session 2. NS and rest did not really differ much in terms of heart rate and respiration rate, but heart rate and respiration rate were reduced as you would expect in sleep compared to, for example, rest. So data analysis ongoing, so watch the space. So I think future studies on NS, and this is something we would really like to do, is really study these practitioners across multiple days. And also contrast the state to other states of consciousness and unconsciousness, in particular those that lay at the boundary of cessation of awareness. I think we should look at, is there still an orienting response? To what extent is self-related information still processed? And maybe also talk a little bit about the no report test that Charlotte talked about in her talk yesterday, sniffing or looking at brain complexity to see how we can characterize this state relatively to what we know of other states of unawareness. We should also try to wake him up. We didn't do that, but in hindsight, I thought I would love to see what would have happened if we tried to wake him up with some pots and pans. And also, I think it's important that more meditators are tested. And so that ultimately will then hopefully allow us to determine whether we can conceptualize cessation as, in a sense, a regular state that occurs between deep sleep and NPE-like waking that we all sort of experience every day, or is it really a unique state akin to hibernation? Is it dissociated from the normal sleep-wake cycle? Is it a state of complete absence of awareness, or is there simply no personal level recollection? And how does it subsequently restructure experience the agent through insights obtained? Of course, this is emphasized within Buddhism as being critical, the long-term effects. And so I hope to have convinced you in my talk that a better understanding of these minimal, non-egoic forms of awareness is really important for a better understanding of the nature of human consciousness and the nature of human mind. They raise a host of interesting questions that I already went over at the beginning of my talk, and now I don't have time to repeat them. And thinking about also the MOC crowd, an important question is also, how can we capture the phenomenology of these states computationally? And what are the implications for consciousness in AI? I mean, large language models are trained on language data. And if language lies not at the core of consciousness, how can they ever, become conscious in the human sense? And so with that, I want to thank all the people that contributed to the ideas and the work presented here today, in particular Ruben Laukonen, because he's fantastic and he really contributed to a great extent to the ideas and the work I presented here today. And I just want to briefly draw your attention to the fact that I also have a postdoc position open on precisely this topic. So if you find it interesting and you're looking for a postdoc, come find me. The deadline for responding is very soon, October 6th. Thank you very much.